Hello and welcome to another All About the Balls special interview. So the fans of the show might remember that a few weeks ago we had Maddie on from down in Melbourne, Australia, who gave us a fantastic introduction to the sport of Aussie rules and the AFL competition down there in Australia. And we thought we would continue this theme, well, that is absolutely bugger all live sport around the world, in trying to introduce everyone to a few more other sports. And what better place to go to next after AFL, but rugby league down in Australia and the NRL competition. And I am joined by Josh, who is, I think to say NRL mad would not be doing you sort of enough of a service. We were just chatting before coming on air, and Josh was telling me that he's actually seen pretty much every single NRL game since 2004, which I think goes beyond being a fan and is actually maybe technically a medical obsession. But Josh, are you there, man? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Oliver. How are you?
Yeah, man. I was saying just before the call, I'm absolutely fine. Like healthy. I was going to say fit and healthy. I don't think fit is quite the right word, but healthy definitely. Lockdown, but starting to go a little bit stir crazy with all of this coronavirus stuff. But how are you, man? You're based in Melbourne, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, and I'm a bit the same. Getting a bit bored working from home and just trying to live my new normal life.
Yeah. And this is definitely not the Corona podcast, but like, how's Melbourne reacting to Corona down there?
It's been a bit of a mixed bag. Like just on the weekend, a lot of people were still visiting our beaches. Like St Kilda was packed, and there's an emergency app we have down here. And in 1 minute, I got 6 beach closures in one go because the government were trying to get people to go home. But
Really?
Other than those silly people, everyone sort of seems to be staying home and working, from home, or they're getting help from the government, which is always nice.
Yeah.
So insane.
Yeah.
It's all crazy.
Yeah, exactly. It is a little bit crazy. I think we've definitely gone through the sort of the first part of like, oh, this is quite interesting. Or this will be something to laugh about when we get back to work. And then you're like, I'm not sure I'm going back to work ever.
It's a collapse as we know it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we are not here to talk about Corona. We are here to talk about rugby league and the NRL. So starting from scratch, because I think a lot of people, particularly over here in the UK, would definitely have heard of rugby league. And over here, it's mainly played sort of up in the north of England, and it's sort of it's kind of seen as the poorer sister of rugby union in a way. Like it's not.
And that's where we start.
Yeah, that's where we start. Exactly. Yeah. So like, what rugby league? What kind of? How is it set up in Australia? What kind of place does it hold in society?
Yeah, well, NRL is the national competition in Australia, so National Rugby League. That's technically been going since the late 90s, but obviously rugby league's been around in Australia since 1908, so a fair while. And started in England, breaking away from rugby union actually because they were the poor cousins and the players wanted to be paid. So back in 1895, I think it was, in Huddersfield, they started rugby league there, and then it sort of made its way down here and we perfected it. And nowadays we have the NRL is like the Premier League of rugby league in the world.
Yeah.
There's 16 teams from right across the country plus one in New Zealand. Which is always quite nice to have. There's teams in Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, Auckland, Canberra, Townsville, Gold Coast, just everywhere. So that's sort of the setup at the moment. It's usually considered one of the 2 major sports in Australia through winter. So that's AFL, obviously, and NRL in there as well, while cricket's off. And yeah, that's sort of the setup it is at the moment. Who knows where we'll end up in a couple of years with this Corona stuff. It's taking a hit, but right now that's the structure of rugby league in Australia. And I think, a lot of Queenslander, New South Wales, Canberrarians love it, but it's sort of sunk into the DNA of Victoria. But, usually South Australians and Western Australians, they don't really get too involved.
Okay, cool. You said, sorry, there's 16 teams?
Yeah, so right now there's 16 teams across, 15 based in Australia, 1 in New Zealand.
Yeah. And is it, so again, we did our AFL chat, there was, Maddie was saying that there was definitely, like, AFL is a huge sport in Melbourne, and so the vast majority of sides in Melbourne. with NRL, is there that kind of city focus as well on any one particular city?
Yeah, well, Sydney is huge for rugby league,
Yeah,
I guess, with the teams that they have. They have most of the teams in the league. It's obviously rugby league in Australia used to be known as the New South Wales Rugby League, and that was where it all started way back when. And so that's the setup. So right now you've got teams across, the whole city, plus, Newcastle, Manly, right up to the Gold Coast and all the way south to the Dragons as well, and St George Illawarra. So it's pretty much spread out across New South Wales,
yeah.
and that's the heartland, but not. It's a traditional heartland, but Brisbane has become, so in Queensland has become the absolute god country of rugby league. So they're insane up there for it, and they've sort of taken over a little bit as the number one. But that feeds back into another competition that the NRL runs, which is called State of Origin. And to put that in perspective, that's like the ultimate. That's the Champions League final 3 times over.
Really?
It's insane. Yeah,
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say it's probably the biggest rugby league event in the world, and the intensity and the craziness that goes with the fans behind State of Origin is intense. It's very tribal. So it's obviously Queensland versus New South Wales, and that dates back to all the player trades that they were making back in the day when Brisbane Rugby League and New South Wales Rugby League hated each other, and they decided to make it a competition. And now it's a 3-game series held every year, usually through the middle of the season. So players get taken from their clubs and they can't play for that weekend, and they sort of go and do the State of Origin camps. Not sure on this year, but yeah, rugby league at State of Origin level is quite intense and probably one of the better things to watch if you've never seen a game before.
So yeah, I mean, like State of Origin is a huge thing. You kind of, this is from an outsider's point of view, but you almost get the feeling that if an NRL player was given a choice, like you have to pick, you either win State of Origin or you win a rugby World Cup, there's a very good chance that they would actually pick State of Origin.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say so as well.
It's that big.
Yeah, it's in the DNA of Australia almost now, because it doesn't just pull well in Queensland and New South Wales. It's across the country. Last year we had a game in Perth. This year there's meant to be a game in Adelaide. There's been games at the MCG in Melbourne. So they take it on the road a bit, and it still gets really good numbers for what it is. I guess it's Queensland versus New South Wales, and Melbourne still can get 80,000 to the MCG in a sport that traditionally isn't a massive crowd game. It's quite a good thing.
Yeah, that's crazy. And am I right in thinking that, I guess across the past, I don't know, decade or so, it's been pretty one-sided?
Yeah. So Queensland,
is that a polite way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so. For a while there, it was neck and neck, and early to mid 2000s, it was looking like a bit of a dynasty to New South Wales, and then Queensland decided to go on an 11 series run rather. So across 11 full years, New South Wales didn't even get a look in. Basically, it ended up being dominance because Queensland basically had the greatest players to have ever played the game at one time. So Cameron Smith, who plays for Melbourne Storm, still going. He was playing with his friend Cooper Cronk and Billy Slater. Jonathan Thurston, who's also deemed as the best alongside Cameron Smith. They were all in the one team, and New South Wales changing coaches, changing players, couldn't get it right, hating on each other, and lost 11 in a row.
Man, that is brutal. 11 years in a row. That must have been hard work for a lot of Blues fans.
It was. There was all the media reports saying that it was dying, it was killing it all off. But I don't think I've ever seen a bigger reaction in rugby league when New South Wales finally broke the drought.
That's very cool, man.
And then they lost 3 more after that, by the way.
But the point is, it was not 15 in a row, so that's okay.
That's very true. I actually think I got my numbers wrong there. I think it's 8 in a row, then a break, and then 3 losses. So in total, it was.
Oh my god!
It was 11.
Yeah, that must have been. Actually, I had a good mate who was a Blues fan, and he stayed strong during that whole period. But my god, did he cop a lot of flack from everybody else around him. So one of the things that I've always found quite interesting about NRL is kind of some of the history it's gone through. Particularly around the the Super League saga, and I don't know. I know enough that it was like a big thing, but I don't know any of the details. But I think it'd be really interesting if you're okay to sort of talk us through that a little bit, because it's something that I don't think happens very often in sport over here. So it'd be really cool to learn about a bit.
No, yeah, it was. I guess it was similar to the coronavirus and what it could have done to the sport. Could have very well have killed it off, which is a very tense time. Luckily, I was like 2 years old, so I wasn't. I wasn't being.
No scars.
No, I wasn't stressed out. And my team, the Melbourne Storm, they were born out of this basically, so I'm happy. It worked out for me. But basically, in layman's terms, you had Rupert Murdoch and News Corp. Versus Kerry Packer and I think it was Optus Vision back in the day, trying to basically buy the sport and make it their own. They wanted to run rugby league as their own sort of competition. So News Corp wanted to make it a global game, so they wanted to include England and Australia and New Zealand, and they wanted to just go in like very similar to the cricket. And I think it was very much shared with Kerry Packer as well, but he ended up, I believe, with the ARL at the time, which was the Australian Rugby League. So in 1997, they went head-to-head. So you had the Super League versus the ARL. So two competitions of rugby league running professionally in the world at one time.
Really?
Yeah, so competing for crowds, competing for TV, competing for all of that. And it's, there's two premiers in 1997 technically. The Crown, the Broncos and the Knights, and Broncos won the Super League, the one Knights the ARL, but no one really counts either.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so like how is that? How many seasons did that happen for?
Well, the main tense time was that 1997. So Super League had sort of brewing for a few years. I think 1994 or 5 or one of those years was when it sort of became a thing. And then it just sort of boiled until what's known now, I guess, as the war is 1997. Very much the year of rugby league going at itself. It was just eating itself away. And I think it hurt a lot of people. There's a lot of anecdotal, stories out there where people who never supported the code again or their clubs were kicked out, like North Sydney Bears, Manly, all these teams went through horrific, Northern Eagles, went through horrific sort of, period because the competition had to then come back into one and become just, I think at the time was, they had 20 teams and then they wanted to drop it right back and then they were 14 and the South Sydney Rabbitohs went through a 2-year high court battle and then they were 15 for a while and then it was a tense time in rugby league. So it could have been a bad thing.
Yeah, that is crazy. Like, I mean, I guess I'm trying to think of any kind of equivalent over here, but there isn't really anything. Like there's, when the Premier League started in the football, that there wasn't a split there. They just sort of created a new sort of first division, if you like, top division, and had it as its own separate sort of branded entity. But there was still promotion and relegation between that league and then the next league down, and the clubs didn't have to choose which one they were in, and it was it was all kind of, I think it was more of like a marketing and commercial thing than actually splitting a code in half. I mean that's pretty insane.
Yeah, exactly. And there's all this, they still talk about it on all the NRL shows now. Their teams were being signed up to another league and players were being signed up to another league. And I was a reporter in North Queensland for a while, and I did hear a couple murmurs from a player that I knew in this town that I was working in, that there was a night where the Cowboys were taken to a dinner and given lots of alcohol. And at the end of the night, the Super League organisation sat there and just said, "Here's $400,000. Here's $100,000. Here's all this money." And they signed all up the players to their league. Obviously I can't confirm that. This player told me this, when I was working as a reporter and not on the record, obviously. But yeah, it just sounds like at the time, if you're a player, you're benefiting. But if you're an administrator or the league itself, it just wasn't great. And a lot of people felt the pain.
Yeah, that's like proper Wild West stuff. Like, Jesus, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. So okay, you've mentioned a few team names so far. And you've mentioned that you're a Melbourne Storm man. Is that right?
Yes, so I'm a diehard Melbourne Storm fan. So my whole life been supporting the mighty Storm, and yeah, I get a lot of flack for that. I reckon they're the most hated team in the NRL.
I was going to ask, give us a little bit of an insight then into a few teams. So, okay, let's start with the Storm then, as your sort of your pride and joy. So, why are they hated then? What is it about them?
Well, they're complicated as well as everything is in rugby league, coming from that working class background. But they were very dominant through the mid 2000s. And I think a lot of people, particularly in Brisbane, love them because they had guys like Cameron Smith, who's still the captain. He's played the most ever games in history. And he was, a state of origin leader along with his friends Cooper Cronk and Billy Slater. So they're all in the Storm team through that period. But then in 2010, it comes out that Melbourne Storm have been cheating the salary cap by a fair margin, and they lost two premierships from 2007 to 2009, plus three minor premierships from 6, 7, and
Oh
8.
wow!
Were struck out of the competition in 2010, made to play for no points. And ever since then, there's been just this real, I guess, hatred towards them. And it's become worse in the past few seasons because no one likes Cameron Smith anymore, I don't think. Whatever he says, people ridicule, unfortunately, which I don't agree with. Because
he's also a legend. He's one of the greatest players, isn't he, to play the game?
Well, he is the greatest, I reckon. Like, no bias here, but he's played more than 400 games. He's done. No one's gone close to that. He's playing in the hardest position on the field, which is hooker, which is your dead center. You're one of the smallest guys on the field. You do nothing but tackle all game. Plus, then you have to make the right decision with the ball going left or right. So, he's in the hardest position. He's won so much, many competitions. Admittedly, he hasn't done it yet without his friend Cooper Cronk, who is our halfback, which is another key role. But he's a legend. But unfortunately, he played for Queensland in an era of dominance, so people were a bit upset in Sydney. And then he played for a team that's considered cheating. And there's been rumours. I don't know, it might stir some rugby league fans up, but there's some rumours about they invented some wrestling in the tackles, and it sort of slowed the game down a bit to their benefit. That's been a long, heated argument. So basically, long story short, is that's all contributed into a lot of people despising us. But that's okay because we're still winning. We're still at the top every single season.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so okay. So, like you say, hated by many, loved by many. But so a Melbourne Storm they're one of the teams that are always up there.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say since 2006, they have basically been in the top half of the ladder. Obviously, just take away 2010 when they finished dead last because they weren't allowed to accrue points. But other than that, they finished at least in top six ever since. And they don't miss the finals. They haven't lost a round one match with current coach Craig Bellamy since 2003. So.
Man, that's insanely consistent, isn't it? That's incredible. So is there anyone else, any other clubs who are on that most hated list?
Well, it depends where you are and who you support, but a lot of universally hated teams. There's Manly, Warringah Sea Eagles, so they're Northern Beaches of Sydney. And in the 80s, they had that silver tails, they're going to buy all the players sort of vibe about them. So people didn't really like them. And then it only sort of got worse as they got better. And there's just a weird hatred for Manly, but they egg it all on. All their fans, they don't care. They just go. There's a sign that always comes up at every game that says, you hate Manly, we don't care, or something along those lines. And then
they actually embrace it. It's part of the culture.
Exactly. And then for a while, it's been either the Brisbane Broncos if you're in Sydney, or if you're anywhere else, the Sydney Roosters, because they are another one of those buy at all cost, win everything sort of teams. They're the first team to go back to back since the Broncos in I think it was 92 and 93. So they've just gone back to back. Unfortunately, they won the last two in a row, and sadly, they beat the Melbourne Storm the other year in 2018, which is to my disgust. But anyway.
Yeah. So actually, I mean, so one thing you just said there actually about buying players, because one of the interesting things I think about the NRL is that it's got a salary cap in place, hasn't it?
It does. weird, probably a terribly small salary cap in comparison to some of the sports you guys play over there. But yeah, we have, I'd say, a limited salary cap, good for what rugby league is down here.
Yeah, I mean, because that's one of the things. Like over here, we don't. Well, we've got salary caps definitely in rugby union. I think in rugby league, but we don't have it in things like the football. So like the Premier League has no salary cap, and the idea of putting a salary cap onto the Premier League football is just insane. But does it work well? Like, does it help actually keep the competition kind of rotating between who's succeeding and who's not?
I don't know if it works as well as they'd hoped.
Yeah,
Simply because
yeah,
you've got
yeah.
teams like Sydney Roosters, Melbourne Storm, Brisbane Broncos who continuously churn out consistent football. I think it's more in rugby league. It's very complex, but it basically boils down to the third party deals you can get and where you're situated. So Melbourne Storm, they're a family glamour club, I guess, to the
Right.
players. They're really consistent, so players want to come here. And then you've got Sydney Roosters, who their owner, or their chairman, just has the most business contacts you'll ever hear of. He's insane. He's a very wealthy man, and he just gets them all in and gets some third party deals or whatever he does to get them in and makes the club successful.
Yeah, yeah,
So there's
yeah.
teams like that, and then you've got other teams, unfortunately, like Gold Coast Titans are just the worst team I reckon we've got at the moment, and they've been historically pretty poor since they came into 2007. And no one wants to go there. You go there to get big money if they're willing to pay it for you, or you go there to sort of finish your career and try and start something. They're just sort of a last resort sort of team. So that's where
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
imbalances
yeah.
come in, and it's a bit odd, I think, because you do have a salary cap. You'd think it would, affect the ladder more, but it just hasn't.
Yeah, no, I always find it kind of interesting, like the salary caps and whether they really do work or not. And I listened to a few sort of NRL podcasts, and it seems to be one of the most consistent topics year in, year out, that there is some kind of salary cap breach, or there's rumors about how the Roosters are making it work this year, and yeah, the Broncos have managed to sign another player, but hang on a second, how is that even possible? Like, I can't remember who it was. There was one of the journos there was saying something like there have been a tiny number of years within the NRL sort of recent history where there hasn't been a salary cap breach. Like, it's in the absolute minority that there hasn't been a breach of some sort. Some are big, some are small, but yeah, it does seem like the NRL have said, look, here are the rules, and the teams have just gone, right, let's find a loophole, let's find a way around this. Like, it's not abided by at all. But yeah, look. But before moving on to the current sort of situation with Corona and how it's affecting the game, I just want to get like, who's your second team then? If there's a few teams that are sort of hated, who are the sort of the favourite second teams in the sport?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I haven't really put too much thought into that. Pretty narrow to the Storm. I'd say someone who's topical at the time. So maybe the Canberra Raiders. They had a dream run last year. They're always fun to watch. Or even the New Zealand
Mm.
Warriors, because of my Kiwi heritage, I guess. Half my family's from New Zealand. I don't mind seeing the Warriors
Okay,
go well,
cool.
but I don't really
Yeah,
have a
yeah,
second. I
yeah,
just like the sport, I guess. I just watch the sport. I love the sport as
yeah.
my backup.
Okay, perfect, perfect. So it is, as we know, a global pandemic right now, and NRL is being impacted for sure. But like, what's happened? Because the NRL season only kicked off recently, didn't it?
Yeah, so about 3 weeks ago, so this was meant to be round three just gone. We got kicked off opening round. So we run Thursday to Sundays, like the games. So Thursday night football rolls around, and it was still very much in the coronavirus. Let's have a chuckle about it. This will be interesting. By Sunday, the AFL were talking about calling themselves off. The NRL were going, we don't know what to do. And then by the end of that weekend, there was no crowds allowed in for round two. So we got last
Really?
weekend, we got round two underway. So AFL round one and NRL round two, both played in front of empty stadiums,
Wow.
which was crazy to watch. So if you have time, go look it up because it's odd. You can hear every hit, you can hear every call the referee makes. It was just really different, but really interesting at the
Yeah.
same time. To hear the contact, the talk, like it was just a hive of chatting on the field. You could hear everything,
Did
but it
it?
was.
Did it? Sorry, I was going to say, like, did you notice? Like, did it change anything about the players' performance, like the intensity or the accuracy, because, like you say, they could hear each other better? Or was anything changed in the actual game?
Yeah, there's more tries, and I reckon they could hear the referees better. I reckon there was an element to that where the referee was
Interesting.
being direct. So, as I said to you before, I referee as well. So I'm a bit weird. Sometimes I'll look to see what they're doing, to see how the
Yeah.
game's being run, because rugby league's one of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
insane sports where you got to control everything. But I think the
Yeah.
players could respond better because they could hear the direction. So instead of I think it's, if the referee says move, they were like, oh, I better move. They are watching me and they're only worried about me. But I think that's a little bit of an element that came into it because the game just seemed to be a bit faster. The ruck speed was faster. I don't know. It just
Oh,
felt like there was more
wow.
points being scored. Whether or not this year was just an even year, I'm not sure. But it just
Yeah.
felt that
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
referees
Yeah.
had
Yeah.
more of
Yeah.
an impact.
Ah, that's interesting. That's really interesting. But sorry, yeah, you were saying so. Round two was played behind closed doors, and what's happened since then?
Yeah, and then so following that weekend, the rugby league was quite defiant. So they were at all costs they were going to go ahead if they were
Mm.
allowed to. The current executive team of Peter V'landys and Todd Greenberg basically came out and said, if we're told to stop, we'll stop. But for now, we're going to keep moving ahead because their own pandemic expert and biological expert said it was okay for that particular day. So the AFL
Mm.
calls off their league, I think, till the 31st of May on the Sunday night, and then on the Monday night, unfortunately, the NRL's forced into closing because the borders started closing across Australia. So I guess politically,
Oh, okay.
Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, all of a sudden were like, nope, we're closing our borders. And this
Yeah.
happened in a matter of days, and it just snowballed to the fact that Queensland were the last team standing. So this is where it gets ridiculous. Rugby League actually were looking at a mining camp in far north Queensland and Emerald, I think it was, which is a tiny town. No one's there. They have a mining camp. They were willing to take the entire competition there to get it going. But then,
Really?
yeah, I was baffled, but it was great to hear that they were looking at
Yeah,
options.
that would have been amazing.
Oh, it would have been such a sight to see, like almost a world first for something like that.
Yeah.
And it was just incredible to hear that this was being touted. But then the Queensland government said, no, we're going to shut our borders. And I think that just made the NRL realise that they couldn't. New Zealand, so this is also a sad part of it, is New Zealand had played a game in Australia. Basically, more or less, when their Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern shut down their borders, they got stuck in Australia because they had to then go home and get quarantined for 2 weeks, which meant they couldn't send any Australian teams over, but they couldn't go over because they would get quarantined, effectively ruling them out for
Oh,
two
you're
weeks.
joking.
So there's nothing the NRL could have done except put them on the Gold Coast. So they got moved to the Gold Coast for a week, and all the players were kept in the camp. Two went home, I believe, for family reasons. I think babies
Yeah.
on the way and some concerns. So two went home, and the rest stayed. They also had some players on their way over, and they were going to get quarantined, but that got quashed in the end because the NRL were forced. So the Queensland borders were closing. The New Zealand were going into full lockdown, which meant no one could come in. They were like, we can't just trap players in Australia, and we probably can't. It would look bad if they would bypass the rules of border ban. So they just got forced. So on that Monday night, they called it off, and that was it was postponed until further notice. And I think that was a pretty sobering moment for a lot of rugby league fans because
Yeah.
it's got some tough times ahead with its finances. It hasn't been managed particularly well. And there's a lot coming out at the moment about what's been going on behind closed doors, which has frustrated players and administrators and clubs. So it's
Yeah.
all a
So,
bit of
so
a
tell,
mess.
I was going to say, tell what's the current, I guess, sort of biggest concern? Like, I mean, is the sport okay? Is it actually genuinely under threat now?
It depends. It's all very circumstantial. I look at it pretty rosy-coloured, but a lot of people are saying it is under threat in Australia,
Yeah.
as the way we know it now. So the 16 structure under an NRL banner is a bit under threat, but what that actually means is it's not overly clear at this stage because they keep coming out and saying that they've got contingency plans right up till September 1st to get this year underway. So by September 1, they want to kick off this year because that means they can have a grand final in Sydney on December 13 or 20. So there's hope
Oh,
in.
right.
But rugby league, I guess, in a way, hasn't managed their finances well. So they have been raking in a fair bit of money. I think it's 14 million per round for the games on TV.
Yeah.
So that's a fair chunk of money to most people, especially to
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
professional
Yeah.
sport.
Yeah.
AFL was probably in very similar circumstances, but they haven't managed it terribly well. They give clubs grants every year, which are $13 million a year. So that's just to prop the league up. But they just, I'm not really clear on the specifics. I haven't delved too deep because I'm a bit worried about it and I don't want to stress myself out. Um, but it just seems like they've not spent correctly and they've just sort of been running at a high cost when they could have really been saving for an emergency. On Monday this week, so a couple of days ago, they announced $40 million, more or less bailout package for the clubs to get them through to the end of the year. But if
Right.
it does take hold if it cancels rugby league this year and there's no NRL, and potentially if another wave hits the world next year, it really could, put a lot of professional sports under threat. And rugby
Man,
league's one of them, unfortunately.
that's incredible. I mean, like you say, there's I can imagine that they probably had a little bit of a contingency fund, but maybe they were never expecting anything like this, where, like you say, they just would not be able to have any revenue coming in and have to try and completely support the game for a whole season. They just weren't prepared for that at all.
No, it doesn't seem like it. It seems like they sort of, I don't know what the word is, but they might have been a bit spend happy and not planning for any contingencies. I think they had a couple million in the bank that they're now having to use. I think I saw reported somewhere that I think there's $150 million basically there at the moment. They've managed to find a $40 million bailout package. They've managed to work the players into pay cuts, and they've got everything agreed to. So at the moment, it should be okay. Given worst case scenario, if we get nothing in this year, it should be okay. But that doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of pressure in the future. That doesn't mean infrastructure's going to be good again. It's a dire time because Australia, I guess politically, has just invested $325 billion into the economy. So that's 16% of our GDP. But what that means is, for the next few years, you don't know how much government funding will come to sport. You don't know what people will be able to pay for. Like, we're going into a very real economic crisis. And I think we're just not, rugby league as a sport just wasn't prepared. And, these long-term impacts are what they're worried about, I believe. Because they're businesses at the end of the day. They're not safe from everything.
Yeah, and again, I guess that's one of the sort of the potential issues of that kind of structure, isn't it? Where the clubs are set up to rely so heavily upon funding then from that central organisation that the clubs will make their own money and they'll have certain activities that bring in cash as well as then the money they get from the central headquarters. But actually, a big enough percentage comes from that central headquarters and they rely upon it for their business model. And so if that then goes, then suddenly they are absolutely laid bare.
And I think that's where they're at, because a lot of teams lose money every season. And there's some vulnerable clubs out there like Gold Coast Titans, Cronulla Sharks. I don't know about the Cronulla Sharks. It's been reported that they're very vulnerable, but they own their own stadium. So I think that could pull them through. But Manly have been sort of spoken about as being a team under threat, even though I hate them with a passion on the field. They're one of Storm's main rivals. I just would hate to see that go, because, then someone like me loses their team, and that just breaks my heart for them. And it's happened in rugby league. So this is exactly the same threat as Super League war. Like, this is another round of people potentially losing their clubs, and that's devastating.
Okay, so look, let's wrap things up, but we can't leave it on that terrible negative note that the sport might not be there in a years to come. So, what would be great? Like, are there any particular games or players that we should search for on YouTube to get some highlights and to get a real flavour of like NRL at its best? What should we be searching for on YouTube right now? Because I think we've all got quite a lot of spare time to go down a YouTube rabbit hole. So where should we be searching, man?
Should definitely get all about State of Origin. It doesn't really matter what year that's from. It's always been the pinnacle, but jump into State of Origin and have a look at some of those highlights. Look up a player called Greg Inglis's Big Hits. It's insane. He just used to demolish people. So he was a scary human. Probably the 2015 NRL Grand Final. Look that up, the highlights. The North Queensland Cowboys versus Brisbane Broncos. That went to extra time, and I won't reveal who won, but that's a great game of football.
Oh, you tease.
And any Melbourne Storm Premiership wins. So you can look up 1999, 2007, 2009, 2012, and 2017. So get around that.
Fantastic, Josh, man, thank you so much. It sounds like there's a lot going on there, and actually like some genuine so I guess sort of threat and danger to the sport you love. So thank you very much indeed for sharing both your passion and a little bit of insight there. Hopefully we can keep chatting, and maybe when the season kicks off, we can get back on and get a bit of an update about what state the sport's in. But for now, man, thank you so much indeed.
No worries, and thank you for having me on. And if you at all like rugby league in Australia, just feel free to invest. If you've got a lot of money, come down and buy a club.
They're going cheap by the sound of things.
I feel like you could buy the NRL at this point. So if you want to own a league, now's your chance.
Thanks, Josh. Take care.
Thank you. You too.